name is Adam Golov, Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I will be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we will make them available on our website. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. DCL Services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. DCL serves a broad client base spanning all industries. Today, we are thrilled to introduce PG Bartlett, Senior Vice President of Product Marketing at accra. PG leads accra's product marketing function. With 20 years of experience in helping companies improve the way they communicate, PG is a recognized expert. In his previous positions as the head of product management at both Arbortext and Quirk, PG was instrumental in establishing dynamic publishing as a market category and driving growth through the introduction of new products, entry into new markets, and expansion into existing markets. Without further ado, welcome PG.
Thanks, Adam, and hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be part of this, able to present to you today. I've worked with DCL for most of my 20 years in this business and have great respect for the organization, so this is an honor for me to present to all of you. So let's get right into it. You know, the topic of today's presentation is words matter, and I suspect if you were attracted to the title and to the abstract, you probably love language as much as I do. You already know that words matter. What we're going to talk about today is how words matter, what sort of business impact those words have, and then we're going to spend some time talking about, so how do you make your words better? And I'll conclude with a bit about AccraLinks at the end, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So when I was preparing for this presentation, I thought about what are the criteria for words that work, you know, for successful language. And what makes language successful, that is what meets your business goals, can vary. It's some combination of these. So we certainly work with customers who, for whom compliance is their most important criterion for successful language. That is, they have to be compliant, say, with simplified technical English. Comprehension, certainly everyone wants to make content that's understandable. Charisma, I wanted to make it a C word, so it's charisma, but it really is about connecting or engaging with customers, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. And finally, customer experience, which really is the overarching criterion for whether or not language works. Are you providing a consistent and high-quality customer experience at every touch point? And I think all of you know that content is a key part of a high-quality customer experience. Now, often when people talk about customer experience, they think of the transactional side of the experience, but the transactions won't happen if the content doesn't work. And so making the content work is a key part of it. And of course, at many touch points, content is the reason that they're coming to you. So content supports the discovery process, learning about your products and services. It supports the education process. So as they get into it and start making decisions about what they want to do as potential buyers of your software, of your hardware, of your services, of whatever products it is that you're selling. And then of course, when the time comes to install, operate, service, maintain, that's where, again, content drives the customer experience. But let's talk about this idea of charisma. And here I'm talking about tone of voice. I'm talking about the relatability of the content, how well it engages the audience. Now, why would charisma even matter, or tone of voice? Well, I'd like to tell you a story. And it's a story about one company that we worked with, and it's just one example of a number of stories that I've heard over the last couple of years, in particular about companies who are focused on their tone of voice, not just readability, but in fact the relatability, the resonance of their content with their audience. And so they came to us and said, we have realized that as a business, we need a new tone of voice. We need to speak to our customers in a different way than we've been speaking to them in the past. Now, the natural question is, although instinctively I get the idea that a better tone of voice would be better for the company, we still had to ask why. What's going on? And to give you some background, I think we've all realized that more and more content is what's driving customer relationships. According to various surveys, buyers rely on content, and that is, are not interacting with your own salespeople for anywhere from 2/3 to 100% of their buying process. And it's not just marketing content that they're looking at. They're looking at your informative content, your instructional content, that is your technical content. It matters, not only does it matter too, it matters a lot. In many cases, it may matter more than the promotional content that your customers or that your buyers are looking at. And then the next point is an important one. If you're building relationships with buyers through content, then the way your content works or doesn't work is going to matter an awful lot. It's going to make a big difference on whether or not buyers potential buyers want to become actual buyers. And one of the things that this company did was they took their content and removed all of the identifying information, and they did the same with their competitors' content, put it side by side, showed it to their colleagues, and asked them, whose is whose? And the answer was, we don't know. It all looks and sounds the same. And not only does it all look and sound the same, it all has that corporate speak tone to it, which is, we are sitting here at the top of the mountain speaking down to all of you lesser people. And they really, it not only did it sound the same, it also didn't sound very good. And finally, they pointed out that as they gathered customer comments, for all different kinds of feedback on aspects of their product and everything else, they do get comments about their content, whether it's their marketing material or their technical information. And what they concluded was that even people who like them and like their products, love their products, and are even evangelists for the company, say that the content is unmentionably bad. So what? So what they said was, our language is hurting our business. It's hurting our revenue. Now, when I first heard a customer say, our language hurts our business, this was a great moment for me, because I believe, and I think most of you believe, that words matter. But how much do they matter? And why would they even care? In this case, this is a large, very large company, one of the Fortune 500, makes electronic products, and the fact that the language was hurting their business was something that even the executive team became aware of. It wasn't just someone who was interested in technical content or marketing content. It was all the way up to the top of the company, realizing that language really does matter, that words matter. And when you think about, so how does it hurt the business? In this case, it had to do with what I said before. It's about, since content builds relationships for the vast majority of the buying cycle these days compared to how it used to be, the quality of the content matters. The words do matter. How do the words portray the company? I think there's a whole webinar to talk about. So what should your tone of voice be? What are the possible tones of voice? And I'd love to do that sometime for you. But for right now, let's stepping back, you can imagine that tone of voice does establish your corporate personality. It does say who you are, represents who you are and what you're like to potential buyers. And consistency of that tone of voice, as well as the quality of that tone of voice, matter, and they matter a lot. So we talk about how to measure it. And measurement is hard. You can measure at the level of the language itself. And I'm going to show you in the next slide measurements, before and after measurements of readability in particular. But you could look at other aspects of tone of voice such as liveliness or the informality of the content, the ability of the content to engage the audience. You can certainly examine consistency. How repeatably do you, how consistently do you have this, use the same tone of voice, use the same terminology, and how correct is it? You could also measure the impact of your content and improving your content based on activities such as web traffic. How many people are coming to a page? How much time do they spend on the page? How many unique visitors are you getting? Another way to measure impact is support calls. We'll talk about an example of that later. Now, the most important measurement is also the hardest. If you did succeed in getting your organization, say, to make a transformational change in the words that they use, the language that they use, how would you ever identify a revenue impact from that and separate the impact of language improvement from all the other changes that are going on in the organization? And the answer is that that's very difficult to do. I can give you some examples later about how our customers have measured in a more specific way the impact of improving their language, but to say that it has a general impact on revenue, I think, is very hard to do. But I would love to have your perspective, and as you think about what sort of impact language has on business metrics that matter, if you'll enter something in the chat window, we'll review that later, because I think that would be very interesting to get other perspectives on this. And then of course customer satisfaction it's just as hard to separate that from all the other factors, or separate language from all the other factors that can affect customer satisfaction as it is customer revenue. So let's talk about, I mentioned the readability improvements. So we looked at the before and after improvements in readability based on this company's efforts to improve their tone of voice and improve their language. And you can see there's a pretty dramatic difference in a wide range of different types of content they were producing. Now, readability is only one measurement of language, and so I don't want to suggest that this is everything, but we do know based on our analysis of their content that they made significant improvements in other dimensions of tone of voice, as well as the conciseness and relatability of their content. Now, if you go looking for quantitative research that shows the impact of language on an audience, you will find very little out there. The best I've found is this data from a study that the Nielsen-Norman Group did. There's a link to it in the slide here. Nielsen-Norman Group has been doing usability studies and training people on usability, especially for the web, for at least 20 years. And I've been following them for a long, long time. So you can see it's nngroup.com. Well, so they conducted a study where they measured the impact of changing only the words, measured the impact on the audience. And it was, and the impact they were measuring was how well does the audience retain the content? How well did they get the message? So I use the word engagement as a proxy for that understanding. And I have to include this quote from one of their reports. It may not be this one, but they comment that users hate marketees. Marketees. Of course, no one really likes promotional, boastful language. We know we're being hustled when we see that sort of thing. So so to test this, they said, okay, let's take some content and let's rewrite it with specific changes in mind. So the first impact that they wanted to assess was, what if we make the content more objective, get rid of the marketees? And what they found was a 27% improvement in engagement. They said, okay, now let's take a look at making it more scannable, just making it easier for the audience to pick out the words and concepts that were most important. And they found that that improved engagement by 47%. There's one other dimension that they measured, and can you think of what that would be? The third one? It might not surprise you, but they looked at conciseness, just cutting out the words. Making it half the size had the biggest single impact on engagement. Now they put all that together and they found out that they improved engagement by more than double. But not surprising that making your content concise and getting your point across more quickly has the biggest impact on your audience. And I think we all know that writing content that is just the right length and no longer is hard. And if you're a writer, as I am, you know that the words just flow. And sometimes we fall in love with our own words, and we end up with often way too many of them. And so the advice generally is to edit with vengeance. We'll talk about that more later. So the same group, Nielsen-Norman group, also published an article, and you can see the link here, what makes a web page work? So what makes your words work, and not just your words, but your words in the context of a web page. And this is their best advice for making your content more usable. Make it scannable. And bulleted lists certainly help with that. Highlight the keywords on the page. And I've used, I think, the same highlights that they used when they published their list. Make sure your subheads are meaningful. That's not a place to be clever. That's not a place to be cute. Make sure that people know what they will get if they read what's below your subheads. Keep it simple. One idea per paragraph. There's nothing that any of us hate more than seeing these 15-line paragraphs in a web page with 4 or 5 different ideas in them. It's too much. It looks like too much work. The second to last point, you're not writing a novel where you're building up to a big finish, a big finale, a climax. Start with the end. Start with the point that you're trying to make on the page. That's when you have the reader's greatest interest, is in when they're looking at the headlines and the subheads in the first sentence or two. So start with the conclusion, the point you're trying to make, and then, as you'll hear over and over again, keep it short. So we like to summarize what makes content great into these 5 different categories: findability, readability, making it engaging, doing that consistently, and ultimately for many of you, it's also making it translatable. And you'll see later that sometimes these can be at odds with each other, which makes it an interesting job. So let's talk about improving findability, because certainly if there's no point in writing great content if no one can find it. And in fact, I'm at a conference this week called the Best Practices Conference, and one of the topics that's come up several times has been the importance of making the content findable and how much it matters to customer satisfaction. Because of course, if someone's going to look for content, especially technical content, if they can't find it, that is a big problem. And it's interesting how some companies are dealing with that problem, and in some cases they're their own worst enemy because they put that content behind a firewall, so when people Google for it, they can't find it. They don't find it, it's not there. Now you can have Google index content that's hidden behind a firewall, and that's something to consider. That's, in fact, it's not on this slide, but that's something I think that's very important to do. So how do you improve findability? Well, keywords still matter. That is, there are words, that is keywords or phrases, we'll call them keywords, that tell Google what your content is about. It tells the reader what your content is about. And we're not talking, by the way, when we talk about optimizing for findability, and that is the result being that you rise higher in the Google search rankings, we're not talking about fooling Google. We're not talking about some sort of black hat SEO techniques, despite the use of the term SEO here. We're talking about making sure that content that should be found is found. Content that deserves to be found needs to be found. So make sure you're using the words that people will use when they go to search for your content. It's not the words that you use, it's the words that users use. And those words should appear in the prominent places in your document, again, so that you can help Google know what your content is about. Again, this isn't about fooling Google. So it's not like you can take a keyword, repeat it 1,000 times in your content, and Google will automatically raise your ranking. That may have worked at one time. It does not work now. In fact, you will get punished for it. You don't get rewarded for it. And it does help to make your content unique. Not just your title. Making your title unique is very important. That's the page title, not the first large title on the page, but the page title itself. That should be unique to help Google understand that this page is the page that's about that keyword. So what's the value of improving findability? You can imagine that. We worked with one customer who did a specific, a careful before and after test where they could isolate just the impact of improving the SEO of their support articles, and so they took a subset of them, optimized them, and what they found is that hits on those pages that they'd optimized more than doubled from what they were before, and that support calls related to the topics that those pages covered dropped by more than a third. So a dramatic impact simply by improving findability. And does that have an impact on customer satisfaction, on customer retention, on revenue? Probably. It would be foolish to think that it has no impact. How measurable is that? That's really hard to say. But the vast majority of your customers prefer to service themselves. They don't want to call support. In fact, Forrester published research that suggested that typically 72% of buyers of B2B products don't want to call support. They want to do it themselves. We're in a self-service economy, in part because people want to take care of their own needs at the time they want to and the way they want to, and so clearly customer satisfaction can be severely affected by the findability of content. Now I want to talk about another comment on how to improve the findability of your content. What Matt Cutts says, and he's an expert at Google on SEO. He does a lot of podcasts and videos and blogs about that give advice to people like me who want to know how to improve the findability of their content. And what he says is, look, our advice is focus on quality. It's not about trying to trick us. Just focus on quality. And in particular, the clarity of what you write. The clarity of what you write matters a lot. Make things as natural sounding as possible. Don't try to fool the engine. But he's also saying it's about natural language. Google is getting very smart about being able to parse out language. And when you talk about improving clarity, improving readability, what can you do? The advice, of course, is primarily keep it short and keep it simple. Complex phrasing, use of double negatives or even triple negatives can make it very difficult to parse a sentence. Eliminate the words that are weak. The word very, for example, is often it's overused almost every single time it appears as unnecessary. Right? It's completely redundant. In fact, what I just said, completely redundant. The word completely wasn't necessary. It's redundant. And cleaning up your language and getting rid of the adverbs can help a lot. Jargon can be good jargon or bad jargon. When I use jargon in this way, of course, I'm talking about avoiding jargon that your users don't understand. There is jargon that your readers expect to see, and if you're not using it, then that's going to hurt you. But you should avoid jargon they don't understand. And then consistency is key, and not just terminology. Really, all the words that you use, consistency is key. I'm a fairly technical guy, but when I go and read about some new technology where I'm not familiar with the terminology, sometimes I find that people have creatively used different words to mean the same thing simply because they get tired of them. Well, that's not helpful to anyone who's trying to learn about technology. That's just frustrating, and it irks me. In case of sentences, it's short and simple, of course, and use active voice rather than passive voice. Keep your sentences simple. Subject, verb, object is the best and easiest construction for everyone to understand, whether they're native language speakers or speak English or whatever language you're writing in, if they speak that as a second language. Now, I went overboard in the title when I said people don't read, they scan. It is true that people are scanning. They're scanning for what they want to read. So the first and most important point when you're publishing web content is to make sure people can figure out if they're in the right place, and then encourage them to read based on your headlines and subheads. And so there tends to be an F shape, F as in Frank shape, to what people actually see in a web page. And you can see that there's almost complete, and by the way, I should say that the areas that are the reddest are the areas where people's eyes tend to focus the most. And this is based on an actual eye tracking technology that watched people's eyes and looked where they looked when they went to a web page. And the page on the left is an About Us page, and the page on the right is some sort of a product description page. And you can see what part of the page they spend the most time on. And this can be valuable to you because you can also see what people are blind to. They're almost blind. Well, they're completely blind. If you look at the right side of the left-hand page, they didn't look at the ads. It's called banner blindness, also called, I think, right side blindness or something like that. But people just don't look. Our eyes don't see that content anymore at all. Not to say you shouldn't have a banner here and there, but 3 banners competing with each other may be worse, a lot worse than 1. And of course, people do read. They don't just scan. And then the next bit of advice is improving engagement. So we talked about findability and readability already. The next one is improving engagement, and that's about being personal, about being direct, being concise, being lively. Lively, for example, varying your sentence length rather than having a monotonous cadence to your sentences or even having a very long sentences. Both of those things have a big impact on the liveliness or the just make the fun of reading your content. Vary sentence length. Incomplete sentences are okay. It's not always about being a slave to the rules of grammar. Now we'll talk about the counterpoint to that in a few minutes. And third, make it scannable. People have got to be able to find what they want. And there's a lot of taboos. Some of them we've covered already. Buzzwords are my pet peeve when I read content from companies, especially press releases. Press releases seem to be the place where all buzzwords go to die, and in fact, in some press releases, they can be 50% buzzwords, impenetrable, completely useless for conveying information. And there's lots of great buzzwords lists out there. I already published, or will soon publish a blog with a list some of our favorite, or perhaps I should say least favorite buzzwords. Solution being at the top of the list, although people still use it. Not necessarily wrong, but it is a buzzword. But the buzzwords: robust, state of the art, leading edge, bleeding edge. It doesn't take very long for some cool new phrase to become a buzzword and lose all meaning. Jargon, complexity, superlatives, boastfulness, and on the other extreme, equivocations. Words like a little bit, or really, or kind of. When we use that in our spoken language, it reduces the power of our words. When we use that in written language, it's even worse. Being impersonal, verbose. Of course, you need to be relevant. And then finally, it needs to be scannable. The unapproachable walls of text is something that nobody ever wants to see. They just won't look at it. Now let's talk about consistency. There's 2 aspects of consistency. We think about style and about the words themselves, the terminology. And when it comes to style, as I said earlier, it's not just about grammar. Do I care about serial commas? Are you in favor? Are you against? I mentioned I was at this conference with a speaker yesterday. One of the speakers said, ask for a show of hands. Who's pro serial comma? Almost every hand went up. Who's against? I think there were 1 or 2 hands. So most people seem to like serial commas, at least in that particular group. But really, do serial commas matter that much? Yes, it's important to comprehension. It does keep it simple. It separates the parts. I prefer them. I didn't used to. I've changed. Was I wrong before, and am I right now? Well, of course. But that's not the point, right? I mean, it's not only about matter. Can you split an infinitive? Yes, you can. Is it a good thing to do? No. Is it a bad thing to do? Well, how bad is it? I will take some effort personally to avoid splitting infinitives, but I'm not a slave to it. And the reason I do it, by the way, is to improve translatability, not because I think an English speaker is going to have trouble with my English split infinitives. And then terminology. And people will adopt style manuals, their own style manuals, perhaps use something like the Chicago Manual of Style. There's lots of great style manuals out there, and some companies have created their own and even published their own. And then terminology, using lists, whether it's using software like accra to enforce terminology, or at least using spreadsheets or something so you know what the right terminology is part of being consistent. But I mentioned before that being engaging can have an impact on translatability. One of our customers once said in a presentation, and I love this way of saying it, he said, to make content really engaging, it needs to be clever and cultural. But he pointed out the most difficult content to translate is content that's clever and cultural. How do you balance that? You have to decide, and it depends on the context. Purely instructional content, it doesn't have to be bland, it doesn't have to be personality free, but it does have to be translatable, ought to be translatable more easily at less cost than, say, promotional content that might be the first brush that some new buyer has with your content. Now there's so much great advice in this book that's pictured on the right. John Cole has written an article, and I'll come to that in a moment, that you can get for free that summarizes a lot of what's in the book, but he's got this wonderful book that he's written on how to write content to a global market, and in particular, so when he says global market, he means for people for whom English is not a first language, and also for translation, to make translation easier, whether you're using machine translation, which you should be doing increasingly, or strictly human translators. Now, I've got this bit.ly link, and I made it really big so all of you could see it. You can, of course, get this bit.ly link from your, if you download the slides, but I thought I'd go ahead and tell you right now. It's the digit 1, TQ, lowercase tq, uppercase T, 53, and lowercase l. So I'll give you a moment to copy that down if you want. It's an 18-page PDF available at that bit.ly link that I set up for you. You don't have to follow this whole oasis-open.org/blah, blah, blah. In order to get it, you can just use that bit.ly link and get a very nice article. And if you love language, you'll really appreciate the detail that John goes into in this article. If you want to pass it on, if you look at it and your eyes glaze over, then you should really pass it on to someone else. It's great stuff, very interesting, and he's right on target, but it's not for, it may not be to everybody's taste, just because it's so detailed and so precise. So, good writing is pretty difficult. It's so easy for jargon to infect our own writing. We talk to our colleagues more than we talk to customers, unfortunately, and as a result, our language becomes burdened by the jargon that we use to talk with each other. And so putting yourself in the frame of mind to talk to a customer and getting rid of jargon when it's irrelevant to the customer or confusing to the customer is critical. Buzzword compliance is the term I use to describe, the CEO's tendency and maybe sometimes marketers' tendency to want to have the right words in there. If everyone's talking about big data, by gosh, we should talk about big data. If everyone else is selling solutions, we've got to be talking about selling solutions. If it's all about being human-centered design, then we should talk about human-centered design. And I heard human-centered design spoken about a few times this week at the conference, and I think to myself, how long before that's a buzzword that makes people's eyes glaze over because they really don't know what it means. It doesn't mean anything to them inherently, and it just becomes an overused buzzword. The third point, anyone who takes pride in their writing wants people to be impressed with their writing, but really the desire to amaze, to impress, is something we should suppress as writers. It's really about getting the ideas across in a way that's engaging and findable and readable. I mean, you know the story. And I'm not accusing you of having a desire to amaze, and I'm not sure that I'm so guilty of that very often myself, but it certainly does influence some people, especially people who aren't professional writers. Certainly knowing what the rules are is hard. There have been a lot of books published about how to write, And there's, in fact, a wonderful new book by a woman named Anne Handley, whose book is entitled something like Everybody Writes, and then a whole long subhead. But it's Everybody Writes. It's a brand new book, and it's in particular written for people who want to write marketing types of content. But she has some great great sections on how to avoid a lot of the problems that typically infect our writing, and as well as what the right process is for writing effectively. How do you structure your writing? How should you structure your writing process? What's the best way to write efficiently and effectively? And the last three are variations on a theme. The last two, I mean. So when it comes to getting the words right and getting agreement within your organization that words matter is not necessarily an easy thing, and it would be interesting to talk about that some more. When I think one of the most effective demonstrations I've ever heard of a company doing was the one I mentioned earlier, where they took their content, their competitors' content, removed all of the identifying information and put it side by side and asked their colleagues to tell whose was whose. Another way to get people to appreciate the fact that words matter is to read the worst content out loud. If you read content out loud and it sounds so stilted and so unnatural that you can't bear to keep going, that's a very good indication that of the kind of impact it's having on your audience. So getting agreement within your organization that words matter and that the word choices that you have may be wrong, and that it's having a negative impact is a significant milestone in getting an organization aligned on getting the language right. But then you say, okay, we have agreement that our language doesn't work for us. How do we get it to work? What is the right language? And there are some experts out there who do this sort of thing. There's a couple of ebooks you can find on tone of voice. You can search for tone of voice ebook. You won't find ours, unfortunately, because I'm working on it, but you will find a couple of others that are pretty good. But knowing who your audience is and knowing what your own personality is as a company and being true to that personality is critical to establishing the tone of voice that you're looking for. Certainly outside experts can be very helpful. There's a company, for example, a consulting firm that started in London but has an office in New York called The Writer. You can find them at thewriter.com, and they're just one of a few. I'm just mentioning them as an example of a consultancy that can help companies establish their tone of voice. Not just establish what it is, but also give you tangible examples of how it works. So whether you do it or whether you hire the writer or someone else to do it, in order for people to understand what you're aiming for, you have to show them, here's what we have and here's what we want. Before, after, again and again and again, to really drive the points home. There's a company, I don't know anything about them, but the website is abccopywriting.com, all one word, ABC Copywriting. And they have some really interesting articles about how to describe your tone of voice. For example, they say that you should have no more than 3 adjectives and that you need to describe what it means to go too far. So you could say, for example, we want our tone of voice to be warm, but we don't want to be overly friendly or overly familiar. So there's the warm, but not too warm, not too familiar, not too personal, and then give examples of that. Certainly you need to state what your goal is in getting the right words. What are you trying to do? How do you want your audience to perceive you? And I can't emphasize this enough, you have to be true to what your company really is. If your company is a formal, stuffy kind of organization, you can't really write a bunch of friendly copy and then have people interact with your employees and a very different experience than your copy implies. So you do have to shade things to be true to what your company really is. When you're writing, always start with the ending. You heard that before. Start with the conclusion. Cut copy with great vengeance, and even though that part is hard. And then good advice is, as I mentioned before, read it aloud. we have software that helps with that, checking content. So I'm almost at the end here. The summary is great content with these attributes can lead to a great customer experience, and having content drive a great customer experience, I think you'll all agree by now, has great business value. It's not just about satisfying our own desire for good content. So a bit about Acralinks. We started out as a project at the German Research Center for Artificial Intelligence. So we started out in Berlin, but now we have headquarters in the U.S. in Silicon Valley. And although we started as a project, we were spun off as a separate company in 2002. And all the lovely logos on the right indicate that I've been doing my job. And we've worked with, primarily the customers we work with are in companies where content matters, mostly on the technical side, increasingly on the marketing side as well. And these are the kinds of, a representative list of our customers, typically medium and large companies with large groups of authors, or at least medium-sized groups of authors, where they want to speak with one voice, they want to speak consistently, use consistent style, consistent terminology, so they can look like one company to their customers. And with that, there's my contact information. Would be glad to have you email me with comments, questions, that sort of thing. And also, well, I'll let you take it back over, Adam, and then we'll go to the Q&A.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, PG. Definitely, this has been an informative webinar indeed. The first question that has come in is, we write technical documentation, and our writing standards are focused on 3 of your 5 criteria for great content: readable, consistent, and translatable. We don't get measured on findability, and making our content engaging doesn't matter. So why should we care about those?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And there are certainly organizations where the engageability, the engagement that we talked about today doesn't matter. If you're writing aircraft maintenance documentation, that's probably not going to influence, the tone of voice is not going to influence the decision to buy an airplane. But I can tell you that increasingly there's a whole lot of products. Well, I mean, we heard that this week at the conference. Lots and lots of companies are seeing that technical content is helping to drive the buying decision. So it's not just about installation and maintenance help. It's about helping the purchase decision as well. And in fact, and you've seen there's been a number of statistics that have been thrown around about just how much technical content can matter. But if technical content is being used by your buyers, then I think you would agree that the level of engagement that people get with your content does matter. And I understand that technical content, first and foremost, has to be correct and has to be useful. But it doesn't mean it has to be completely devoid of personality. And granted, it's not a bright line. There are absolutely companies where it does need to be devoid of personality, where the whole focus has to be on just solve my problem. But there's a danger without having any personality associated with it. There's a danger of content that's extreme in some dimension. I heard this week, for example, of one of the presenters this week talked about having eliminated documentation that amounted to some 40,000 pages because they realized only 1% of the audience was looking at it. And building that content more into their product, in this case it was a web-based services, and a huge focus on making that content more engaging. But it all depends on the context. And when it comes to the other question, what was the other part of it? Translatability, was that the other one? No, findability. Like it was findability. Why should they, if they're not measured on SEO, why should they care? And I think the answer is, if you're not measured on it, at some point you may be, but I think it's better to get in front of it. Now, again, if you believe that your customers are 100% satisfied with the findability of your content, then of course why worry about it? But I think this is an opportunity within your organization for some thought leadership, showing some initiative. I think the best practices, technical documentation is in flux. There's a lot of change afoot. And making the content more valuable to the organization is the underlying driver for that change. And part of the and a big part of the reason for that is the statistic I quoted near the beginning, which is buyers rely on content to build relationships with with potential vendors for anywhere from 70 to 100% of the buying process. That fact alone, buyers relying on content to build relationships, it means that you as an organization are relying on content to build relationships. I spoke to someone this morning who said that in her company, technical documentation is now part of marketing, and they view themselves, this combined group, as the content engine for the company. And that's a different way of thinking about what technical documentation does, and that technical documentation's role in the organization. And findability is, I would say, this is an opportunity for leadership rather than for sitting back and saying, well, we don't get measured on it, therefore I don't care. Next question.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question is, how is readability measured?
Well, the primary influencers on readability are sentence length and word length, and that's the some people know that as Flesch-Kincaid. And we've gone beyond that in our own measurements. We look at other factors that influence readability as well, such as the use of passive voice. When you write using passive voice, that makes the sentence harder to understand. We look at sentence complexity. So we reward subject-verb-object construction in a sentence and penalize different sequences of subject-verb, from subject-verb-object. I don't know, I'm trying to think offhand what else we do to measure that. We also have, words that we know are complex words, even if they're short words. They may be unusual words, Latin expressions. There's a variety of things that even if they're short, that can have an impact on readability. And so we go beyond what Flesch-Kincaid does, and that's what we do. But Flesch-Kincaid is a good starting point. And even if you don't need accra links to get Flesch-Kincaid, it's even built into Word. You have to go do some trickery to turn on Flesch-Kincaid. But if you Google Word or Microsoft Word Flesch-Kincaid, Flesch spelled with F-L-E-S-C-H, then you'll find instructions for turning that on. Although Word's way of measuring readability has some problems, but that's for another conversation. What's next? Anything?
Thank you. Next question is, my product manager gives us product descriptions that are filled with buzzwords and cliches, and he won't listen to us about fixing them. What can we do?
Oh, yes. Yes, I've heard this one before. Yeah, there's often someone in an organization who's really compelled to be buzzword compliant, and it's a difficult thing to fight against. My advice is writing is so personal. I'm thinking about what the best advice is. It's very situational, of course. You have to know what the personality is of this person, whether or not you could even conceivably change his mind. Feedback from customers is the most persuasive advice, especially for a product manager who is inherently programmed to listen to customers. If you can get customers to come back and say, this is nonsense, or this is something unprintable, that would be the most persuasive kind of feedback you can give them. Another thing you could do is do it before and after. You could, in fact, take the content, rewrite it in something that makes more sense and in its nice, clean, simple, professional but warm English, and even ask your customers to vote on it. Do a little survey and ask them to vote which way they prefer, and show that to your product manager. But they're not going to care about your opinion of what's good writing, because everyone's got opinions about what's good writing, and the problem is we all think that we're right, even when some of us are obviously wrong, and anyone who disagrees with me, of course, is obviously wrong. So that's always a tough one. But I let customers speak rather than using your own opinion. That's my best advice.
Excellent. Thank you. The next question we have, PG, is, our team is sold. Our problem is individuals and other functions contribute, but their content is not good. How would you go about convincing them that the quality of content is important?
That's something else that is true everywhere. There's such variability in the organization. This is where leadership, and this takes time. This is about changing minds, and this takes time. And you need to, I think it's the best, again, coming back to the idea of data or surveys, the best voice is the voice of the customer. And getting the customer to tell you that there is a problem is the best way to convince your colleagues, by showing them what customers say, that there is a problem. This comes back to convincing people that words matter, and that getting everyone on the same page about the right words, the right style, the right terminology, the right tone of voice, that all of that matters and that it's worth doing. And I would say that it's a combination of coming to that realization and then organizing for success in that area. The companies that I think are going to make the greatest headway in this area are the ones that have realized that content, regardless of its role in the customer life cycle, regardless of whether or not it's promotional and early in the life cycle or instructional, comes late in the life cycle, wherever it lands, that content needs to speak with one voice. It needs to represent the company. It needs to be consistent and powerful in the best way that content can be. And I can give you an example of IBM. All of IBM's content now is under the responsibility of one person. That's extraordinary. And this is a company the size of IBM. It's even 1,000 times more extraordinary that a company that large would see the need for content. The role of content is being so important that they'd have one person responsible for all of it. But it's their realization they need to speak with one voice across 2,200 different products, which I learned just this morning. So I mean, I would say that showing your colleagues where industry trends are headed, making sure that your colleagues understand where what the role is of content in your organization, and in your context, maybe it doesn't matter so much. It doesn't matter equally to everybody. We all have our own specific circumstances, and B2B may be anything from very industrial, where the content can be highly compartmentalized and tone of voice really doesn't matter much, to something that's a little that's broader, where more people are involved and there's more. I think when there's more, I'm not sure. I was about to argue that if there's more emotion in the business decision, that's where content can play a bigger role. But I've also have in the back of my head that people make logical decisions for emotional decisions for logical reasons. Ultimately, we're just a big bag of emotions, but we try to give a logical arguments for why we feel the way we do. But anyway, so I probably babbled too much on this one. The answer is that it's a hard one to answer. I hope I've given you some ideas. Any other questions?
Yes, the last question that's come in at this time is, in our TechCom department, we're under lots of pressures to meet deadlines and don't have time to polish our words. How can we convince our management that they should invest more in getting the words right?
That comes back to, I think, helping them understand that words matter. And again, it comes back to voice of the customer. So if you can bring them feedback in the customer's voice about the importance of the words and the importance of the content in supporting the customer, that can be hugely powerful. I'm trying to think of the easiest way to find this, but IBM did a wonderful survey, and in fact, I'm sure you can still find it online, where they asked their customers a few simple questions about the role of technical content in the impact of technical content in their perception of IBM as a company and the quality of IBM's products and their willingness to do business with IBM. Very simple survey. And if you look for IBM customer or survey on technical documentation, and hopefully you'll find something about that. And if you're really interested, there's my email address. Send me an email, and I will send you a link to that survey. But you can do this survey yourself. In fact, I would say my best advice for anyone who cares about content, who cares about the words, and wants to show leadership in your organization is to start gathering data. Be able to talk to the voice of the customer, because that's what's going to resonate inside. And part of that needs to be metrics driven. So something like a survey like such as what IBM has done, and anyone can do this with SurveyMonkey or whatever those other survey software packages are that are out there that are cheap or free. Anyone can do this. It's a handful of questions. You can just do what IBM did, ask the same questions, or ask a couple more. But I think what they've done is pretty smart, and anyone can do it. But start gathering those metrics now. Don't wait until you want to affect change sometime down the road. Start gathering the data now. Gather the customer stories now. Start building your case now, and start building relationships within the organization so that at some point you'll be armed. You'll be well armed enough to go make your arguments.
Okay, thank you so much, PG. That is all the questions that have come in so far. But anything else, we will definitely send it over to you. I'd like to thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar. This will conclude today's broadcast. You'll be able to access the recorded version of this webinar in the archive section of our website, which is located at www.dclab.com. Our next webinar will be Wednesday, October 1st at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, titled 6 Ways XML and Data Can Change Customer Support, being presented by John Lassell, co-founder and president of LaSalle Ramsey, and Amber Swope, data specialist of Data Strategies. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Adam. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.